Hi all. I hope you can hear me.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning. So I can wait a few more minutes before people join.
Sure.
Hello, everybody.
Good morning.
Hey. So you can add your name to participants list while we wait. And yeah, we have a very light agenda today. So if anyone wants to talk about a topic, please feel free to add that to agenda after the Zoom presentation, and we'll see if we have time to talk about that.
Actually, I would have a question. I've seen that you have worked on a vocabulary, on the GitHub repository. May I also add here captain? So make a PR and
please do that.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, because like it is nearly impossible to add all the tools or technologies in this domain. So yeah, anyone wants to add any new tool or technology, that would be cool. So just send a PR.
Cool, I will work on this.
Yeah. And maybe that is a good topic. Actually, we can spend a few minutes on it, because the idea with the vocabulary is not just documenting the vocabulary used by the tools, but to see if we can come up with some, common vocabulary across these different tools. And most of the terms are kind of common, but there are differences.
That's true.
Maybe we can start.
Hi, everybody.
Hey,
it's Tracy.
Hi, Tracy. Welcome.
Hi, thanks.
So, you know how things have been lately, and I hope you are all safe and healthy and staying at home, like everybody says. It's a bit depressing, but life. Just hang on there. And
it's a new way of working. Not so new for some of us, but I was used to going into the office at least 3 or 4 times a week, but now it's the other way around.
Exactly. Like you can go to the office. That is something different than that you can't go anywhere. It's like, it's depressing, even though you work from home most of the times. It is, yeah. Well, not much we can do, I suppose, until this thing settles. So perhaps we can start with action item review. I think we had 2 action items from last week, and they were on Andreas storing captain presentation in the presentation repository, and I think you sent a pull request there, Andreas.
Yes, and it was already merged.
Yeah, so that is done, and I know David from Orange also sent his slides there. So I think we are collecting good material there if anyone wants to look at them offline. So we have clean action items. And the next topic is on you, Tracy, about the roadmap. So yeah. Anything to say about roadmap?
Yes. So a bit of a work in progress, but Let me share just where I'm at. So early days, but I think it's still worth just getting some input. I'm going to share my screen on this document. And
Tracy, would you mind sharing the link to whatever document you're showing us in the meeting agenda? I always depend on going back to the meeting agenda for any previous things that have happened.
okay, let me do that. I'll put it in the chat if someone could stick it in the notes, so I can do that later. Anyone with the link can edit. Okay. Sorry, I'm just got so many tabs, I keep losing everybody. Where are you? Can folks see my screen?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, I put the link in chat and hopefully someone can share it. Okay, so I've mostly got a structure here, but what it's saying is that this is going to map out the roadmap, and don't get too hung up on format, because I think this is just a place we can capture and comment, and then maybe we can move it out to something a bit more shareable. But one thing I just want to emphasize is kind of best practices for roadmap these days, and especially for a group like this, not specifically focusing on specific timelines or delivery dates, but rather using time horizons. So typically now, next, later. So I didn't know, so the next section is charter. I didn't know if we had anything already defined for the group, but I went ahead and just started putting together what I feel is the charter for the groups that we're working to solve the problems of making CI/CD software tools interoperable and interchangeable. And the reason we're doing this because we want to drive CI/CD tool adoption, and we feel it's essential to that, as well as just promoting innovation in the industry. So if we kind of make tools work together, we can get to sort of the next stage of interesting layers. Okay, so, and then I had a thought there, which I have to finish. Okay, so then I was trying to think through what would be the outcomes. And so I have a bit of a mixed bag of things, like some of it is driven by what we're actually doing, but some of it is trying to have the end in mind. So on the one hand, I think we want to all have a better understanding of the different CI/CD tools and how the terminology is used, and how those compare and how we can translate between them. But then equally, this could just be a first step to maybe one of these other outcomes. I think there's a big focus on capturing end user requirements, of just understanding, making sure we always keep the end user in mind. We're not just kind of doing it for the sake of it or in a ways we think it should be done, but driven by actual use cases. So maybe those first two are a bit more of how, but I think some of the things we want to get out of it are, having this shared reference terminology. So it's always clear when people talk about tools, or they can use our reference things to translate between tools. We want interoperable tools that can connect together and work in a predefined way that perhaps is tested, standardized frameworks, and then also promoting best practices, perhaps how tools interoperate. I'll take a pause there, maybe to capture some sentiment or feedback, or see if people think this is on the right track. Any comments?
Looks right to me from my perspective, yeah.
Okay, and as I said, this will be shared around, and I'm still just fleshing out a few things. So then in terms of a roadmap, I'm following this kind of guideline. I put a reference, but there's some folks who talk about, kind of best practices for roadmaps. And so one of the things, anything in the current, or what I'd call now, time horizon, tends to have a specific scope. You tend to have agreement between people of what we're doing and what the outcome will be. And then near term tends to be a bit wider with some more flexibility about what that will mean. And then we have a bucket for future, which will be, you know, a broad scope, very flexible. We haven't talked about implementation yet. It might change depending on the way the industry heads. So those are the three kind of buckets that I want to put things in. And then in terms of what I'm seeing the current, like in the now, we're focused on this knowledge transfer of CI/CD tools. We're focused on capturing end user case studies, and we're focused on, you know, having this shared terminology published. And then next, I think, would be things like, okay, let's talk about pipeline standardization or deployment standardization. And then maybe further down, we'd have things like event standardization. So this is pretty raw. And I think I need to talk to specific groups of people to see what they're thinking of. But just so you know, that's kind of how it's shaping up right now. Okay, so unless there's any questions or comments, I'll work on this for another week or so, and then I'm hoping to have something a bit more, well, presentable for a wider group. And anyone who wants to get involved over the next couple of weeks in the process, you've got the doc, so please just feel free to go ahead and start commenting or start adding things that you want to drive or that have been completed that we should make people aware of.
Actually, I have a question for Fatih. Fatih, do we have any representation from either Spinnaker, an Armory, or from CodeFresh?
Well, Andy Glover is actually a member of the SIG, but he's a busy guy, so he's not joining the meetings. But when we start working with the vocabulary, someone from Spinnaker community show up to that, correcting the mistakes we made there. I can reach out to them again and ask them to invite them to the SIG. So yeah, and for CodeFresh, no, unfortunately. But if you have any contacts, just invite them.
The reason I ask is because both of those tool companies have just a ton of experience from gathering use cases, you know, things that Tracy's talking about right now. They just have a ton of experience with dealing with all sorts of various use cases from, you know, around the industry, and can really turbocharge the process here and provide a lot of input as to what the vocabulary needs to be, you know, what would make more sense, the process and all that stuff. So just wanted to put that out.
Yeah. Well, again, like, yeah, Spinnaker, I know Andy pretty well, so I can spam him, but if like you can help with that as well, that would be great, because like, I don't want to alienate people with too many spams either. So, but yeah, I hear you. In addition to Spinnaker and CodeFresh, I reached out to, who was that person? The SIG, Kay Williams from Microsoft, and asked if she can help us to find some from GitHub, and she told me to send an email to him. So we might have representation from GitHub because they have GitHub Actions, and GitLab was here, but they dropped. So yeah, we have lots of communities represented here at the moment, but we are missing some major ones as well.
So, yeah. I mean, I can obviously provide lots of input. Within eBay, we have lots and lots of different use cases that we come upon that we have to solve. And we've got internal tooling that's doing bits and pieces of it, and, you know, trying to fill in the process as best as possible. But having a tool company represented here that is taking in requests and feedback from all sorts of different companies is pretty valuable. I mean, I've spent some time with Spinnaker and the Armory folks, and they just get tons of input from everyone.
Okay, let me action.
Well, Tracy, sorry, one question back on your doc there. Is there a point at which you want people to start commenting or making suggestions? Like it sounded like next week you'd.
No, if you have something, I would go ahead and just put it in. Yeah, I think if you've got things you think should be on the roadmap, if you've got ideas, like let's go ahead and just get those in.
Okay, great. Thanks.
That's my MVP, so it's ready to go. Yeah.
Thanks, Tracy. I think it looks pretty good start, and yeah.
Yeah, and I think it can take shape pretty quickly, at least a first practical version.
Yeah, and actually the last minute addition to agenda is related to this roadmap. Maybe let me move that point to right here so we don't switch the context. So and Andreas asked if he can add a vocabulary about captain, and obviously that would be great. And my question is actually answered in your presentation or document, Tracy, the next steps with vocabulary and terminology. So maybe we can either wait to start working on establishing this shared vocabulary or the terminology, or do that in parallel if anyone wants to take a first step in that part. Because that was kind of intention when we start with the vocabulary, even though there are many terms used across the different tools and they mean the same and there are few differences. So again, I just want to ask this question: what to do with the vocabulary? What are the next steps? Or should we just ask CDF to help us to make this, you know, more visible by a blog post or something, so we get more eyes on it?
Yeah, actually, just one thing to share from the outreach committee. We're looking at, I think, doing some kind of more themed newsletters. And one of the suggestions I made was that, you know, like they want things like 1 month would be security and another one might be interoperability. So maybe tying into that, and next day would be just producing a handful of different posts, some on the shared vocabulary, some on the tools and how they get used, some on, you know, some on big picture, some on specific tooling. And that's kind of the next step, just getting the word out. And then I would love to see us drive for almost kind of what's our standardized, what's our recommended terms people use, and maybe that's something the Tecton folks can really help with.
Okay. Okay, then we can talk about this offline, Tracy, and see if we can somehow include this in outreach committee radar. And
yes,
yeah, okay. So that was that topic, and moving to the next one. And this topic was included by Christy, but she, as she noted there, she won't be able to participate in the SIG for a while, but I still want to talk about this topic because it is always good that different people, you know, drive the agenda or facilitate the operations or meeting, chair things. So I'm wondering if any of you want to help out with these things.
Sure, I'd be up for yeah, rotating through facilitator duty.
Okay, so then let me add that comment here. Then Eric, perhaps we can talk offline and then you can take over the upcoming few meetings and then craft the agenda and do that type of stuff, and then we see who else wants to help us with this?
You bet. Especially now that the time zones have shifted so that this meeting is at 8 a.m. instead of 7 a.m. It's much easier to get here.
Yeah, and for me, it is actually like for Europe, it is more difficult because it will start at 5 p.m. and that will be difficult for people from Europe because, you know, schools and so on. But yeah, thanks, Eric, for that. And then we see what we do. And the next topic is another presentation, but this time from Zool team. Jeremy kindly accepted to present Zool to the SIG, and he already shared the slides in advance. And I put the slides on in the meeting agenda, and I will share them in parallel to Jeremy. And as usual, please feel free to ask questions, look at the slides, and so on. So, Jeremy, yes, I start sharing my screen, and feel free to start.
Okay. Thank you. Hopefully the voice quality is not too terrible. I'll try to go through this pretty quickly. Zool is a project I've been a contributor to for many years now. So I have a lot of familiarity with it, and I just wanted to quickly go through how the current design of Zool is focused on interoperability, since that's the topic of this SIG and thus these meetings. What is Zool? We refer to it as a project gating CI system. And what we mean by that is that it's designed to have exclusive control over when commits merge to Git repositories. The service doesn't have to be used like that. You can run it in a purely advisory manner, but by giving it full control over whether or not changes are merged, that gives it the ability to actually sequence the order in which commits are merged across all of the repositories that it controls, and the ability to actually test what the state of that set of repositories is going to be from the perspective of all of the CI jobs you've defined at every stage in that sequence. So you don't have to worry about if I approve this change in repository A and this change in repository B at the same time, and one of them is breaking the other and they haven't been tested in the context of one another, or something else has merged that I'm not even aware of because someone on another team that works on software that's related to mine has merged something that's going to cause my change now to break. That's avoided by giving the CI system control over the merging of changes. So it has a focus on Git and code review workflows. This is sort of central to the design, really, because it is basically meant for Git-specific operations, and it's relying on code review interactions for its queues and triggers. But as Git seems to be the predominant revision control system these days, and code review workflows are becoming increasingly prevalent, and the projects that we were working on that prompted us to develop Zool in the first place focused entirely on both of those. That seemed like a reasonable compromise. It's designed to be cross-project, multi-tenant, handle source code from multiple different code review systems simultaneously. So like a large deployment that I operate right now has over 2,000 Git repositories that it's managing. It has source connections to repositories that are in a Gerrit instance, in actually more than one Gerrit instance, in GitHub, and it can basically handle its functionality across those multiple code review systems and try to treat them in a consistent fashion. Even though the exact code review workflows on different platforms do tend to differ a little bit, it has some ways to normalize and generalize those interactions. It is, of course, open source. Actually, it follows what we refer to as the 4 opens: open source, open design, open development, open community. It is focused on everything happening in the open and being open to participation from anyone who wants, all the way from submitting fixes and filing bugs to deciding on what's going to be in the roadmap to the overall governance of the project and direction. It can be run yourself and has actually got a fairly light footprint. There's a quick start on the Zuul website that will install all of the different microservices from containers into a single system, and we actually use this for Zuul to test changes to its own code base, and we do that on a virtual machine with 8 gigs of RAM and like 80 gigs of hard disk. So it and that also based on like an example Garrett and some other stuff. So I mean it's really like you could run it on a fairly tiny footprint if you wanted to. As of 2019, the OpenStack Foundation recognized Zuul as an independent project, so it had been in development for far longer. But OSF effectively represents us and helps us with trademark stewardship and that sort of stuff. So a little bit about the history of the project. Basically, OpenStack was the genesis of the Zuul project. OpenStack began around 2010, and the CI team at the time started using Hudson to do CI testing. The folks from the team that was doing the community infrastructure management for the then forming OpenStack project had worked on another project called Drizzle. And the Drizzle community had this philosophy that if it's not tested, it's broken. So in 2010, when OpenStack began to be a public project, every single change that was proposed to any of the code base had to pass a battery of CI tests and had to be reviewed by other developers before it was allowed to merge to any of the public branches of the Git repositories. Fairly common these days, was actually not that common back in 2010. So we ran into a lot of challenges, especially as the project gained in popularity. We saw a huge uptick in commit activity from developers, increase in the actual CI coverage, as well as the code that was being proposed and the reviews that were being done. So we realized in about 2012 that we really needed to have some way of serializing the changes that were going in, because OpenStack was a multi-repository community of projects, and they had some fairly tight coupling between services in those different repositories. So we needed to be able to carefully test that changes were going in sequence and did not break each other, like I mentioned a minute ago. So that was basically the genesis of Zuul. We needed a way to serialize changes across multiple repositories as Jenkins was testing them, but we did not have enough time in the day to test all of the changes that were being proposed to merge. So we borrowed an idea from a microprocessor design called Speculative Execution, where we assume that changes are going to merge, and that allows us to change the test, allows us to test the changes that follow them as if the change ahead of them has merged. So we include the previously approved changes into the context of the change that's being tested. And then if one of the changes fails, then at that point, we pull it aside and we reset testing for all the changes that were approved after it to no longer include it in the context and retest themselves. So that it gets us a nice compromise between having a serialized merge order across multiple repositories, but being able to still perform testing of all of the changes that are in flight in parallel. So that was really the genesis of Zuul. It was basically just a smart scheduler for Jenkins. That was the 1.0 release, and then in 2013, we were running into limitations in Jenkins itself, especially with regard to global locks for Jenkins slave management. We were hitting around 100 Jenkins slaves, was about the max that we could rapidly add and remove from the master before all of the API calls just started waiting. And so we finally figured out that we were just going to have to run multiple Jenkins masters. But there was really no way for us to run multiple Zuuls because they would need to independently coordinate the ordering of all the changes that were being merged. So we came up with a way through a Jenkins plugin to have one Zuul scheduler coordinate multiple Jenkins masters. And that was basically Zuul v2. It was a multi-master fan out for Jenkins effectively. So you could have a central dashboard. You could evenly distribute jobs across as many Jenkins masters as you wanted. That was actually working out pretty well for us for a few years. And then we got to the point where we had really re-implemented almost everything that we had previously relied on Jenkins for because of the need to have things like centralized dashboards and centralized job management and all that. So at that point, Jenkins was really just remotely running commands via SSH on slaves that we had another separate process that was already managing the slave pool and adding and removing them to Jenkins to fulfill job requests. So we hit on the idea that we could just swap out Jenkins for something which did most of the equivalent functionality. For us, Ansible was a really good fit. It was also written in Python, which is what Zuul had been written in because that's what OpenStack was written in. It used YAML for its configuration, which we had early on in running Jenkins, we had hit on the fact that it was really hard to keep Jenkins configurations in a Git repository. We wanted to do Git-driven public management of everything, including our job configurations, but hand editing XML was kind of painful and extremely repetitive. A lot of duplication. So we wrote a separate utility called Jenkins Job Builder that allowed us to template Jenkins jobs out of YAML and basically avoid a lot of duplication, be easier to edit, easier to review diffs of when we're proposing changes to the jobs and so on. So since Ansible already used YAML for its own, task configuration, that was a nice fit. We could just continue to use YAML for all of our job definitions, including the job payloads, and got a nice kind of synergy from that. So that was, we dubbed 2.5. We basically added an experimental Ansible launcher that was an optional replacement for the Jenkins master in Zuul's architecture. But we were hitting the point where Zuul had gotten kind of cobbled together a bit. We were basically in need of making the entire architecture of the system easier for people to run. A lot of other, particularly open source projects, but also commercial enterprises and so on had started trying to use Zuul, and it was not easy to manage, mainly because of the way that some of these different features had been added on over time. We wanted to make the Ansible launcher more of a first-class component of Zool and more central to the overall design of the system. So that was 3.0. We moved job descriptions or job definitions to be incorporated into the Git repositories that were being tested, rather than having a central repository of job configuration. So effectively allowing projects to manage their own job definitions, more self-service, be able to branch job definitions. So it basically became branch aware from a job perspective. But we did not want to wind up with a whole lot of related projects, including lots of repetitive and possibly over time slightly divergent job configurations. So we designed it to basically centralize job configuration. And so that's sort of the interoperability story for Zool. They're done with the history slide if you're advancing them. The use of Ansible as a job description language, the fact that it shares job definitions between repositories, that it has a central standard library of building blocks, that it supports multiple source connections, that it runs jobs on many environments and across multiple nodes, node groups and so on for a single job if you want, and that it supports cross repository and cross source connection, cross code review system change dependencies. And so the Ansible Executor slide, basically the thought here was that we should not invent our own domain specific language. We wanted to avoid the temptation to not implement it here, have control directly over the language that's used to define jobs. We liked that Ansible was something that a lot of people were already using in their organizations to manage, orchestrate, deploy their software. So it gave them the ability to possibly reuse a lot of their deployment tooling directly in their jobs, or at least more natively in their jobs without having to recall Ansible from shell scripts and that sort of thing. It also made orchestrating jobs across multiple hosts easy from a multi-host job perspective. Ansible was basically already designed to do exactly that. So we didn't have to do anything particularly special to have jobs be able to use multiple systems in a single build. It could be extended with Python modules, kind of much in the same way that we had previously used Jenkins to do a variety of non-core functionality by adding Jenkins plugins. Ansible has a vast library of available modules to do things that people commonly want to do. And it can still easily run arbitrary shell scripts. So pretty much just a few lines of Ansible to run whatever shell command you want. On the job sharing slide, we basically wanted to design a system where workflows and triggers for your builds were not tied to the individual job definitions. So triggering is more of a central concept bound to the pipelines that we have designed, which are global constructs within a tenant that basically say for these particular code review events or whatever outside events, these are the sorts of actions that you want to take, but then projects themselves associate whatever set of jobs that have been defined with pipelines that they want them to run within the context of. so that the job definitions don't have to be centralized, and so that the triggers don't have to be embedded within the jobs themselves. We basically wanted the ability to reference job definitions and Ansible roles in any project from another project. So we came up with safe ways to be able to do that, and still be able to implement encrypted secrets that jobs would be able to make use of. We've got a lot of access controls around how job inheritance works with secrets and how they're bound to playbooks within the repositories that they're included in, and so on. Let's see. Yeah, the story around avoiding a lot of repetition in similar job definitions, kind of the whole reason why we had invented Jenkins Job Builder years before. We wanted a system that allowed you to describe jobs in a way that supported inheritance and the ability to declare minor variations, things like altering variables, passing in extra bits of data, whatever, to a job without having to carry a separate definition of that job. So that tends to be very convenient. We designed it to securely be able to reuse jobs between different branches, different projects, different tenants, different source connections. So you can have jobs that are defined in a repository in Garrett being used to test changes or pull requests to a project in GitHub or what have you. Next on the standard library slide, this is basically a special case of what the overall job and role sharing design allows us to accomplish. We have a community batteries included sort of job repository called Zool Jobs that is intended to house generic job definitions and Ansible roles that those jobs might use, so that people don't have to rewrite the same stuff over and over, and they don't even need to necessarily carry their own copies of this. It can basically be used either with a local fork, if you do want to pin to specific points in time in the repository, or have your own local modifications that for some reason couldn't be handled through inheritance or variation. But you can certainly also either set up like a generic, there's a generic get driver in Zool, which is one of the source drivers it supports. So it just periodically polls a get remote and updates the jobs that it knows about from that remote. So you can continuously deploy the global main copy of the Zool Jobs repository within your system if you wanted to use it that way. Intentionally designed to support that. And we also have a lot of advisory testing happening on that Zool Jobs repository from other sites that have deployed Zool. For example, there's a group in Red Hat that runs a Zool as a service called Software Factory. And every time someone proposes a change for the Zool Jobs repository, because Zool is able to speculatively test proposed changes for its own jobs, all they really have to do is set up a Garrett source connection for the OpenDev copy of the Zool Jobs repository, because that's where it's hosted, and they can automatically provide feedback into the OpenDev Garrett, letting the reviewers of the Zool Jobs repository know, hey, if this change merges, it's going to break these tests that we're running within Software Factory Zool deployment. So basically designed to make things like third-party testing, even of job configurations themselves, easy and straightforward. Onto the multi-connection slide. As I mentioned, Zuul is designed to connect to multiple code review systems at the same time, and there are a lot of people who are using it that way already. It's able to bridge review and hosting platforms, including currently Gerrit, GitHub, Pagure, statically hosted Git. There's an experimental GitLab driver that's not quite got as full feature parity with some of the others yet, but is in nearing completion from that perspective. There's also a Bitbucket driver that is currently in progress. There are changes proposed that would add it to Zuul's drivers. And I know there are a couple of folks who are successfully using it, but they're still trying to work out some intermittent connection bugs from what I understand. But basically it's designed to support and have a nice driver interface for whatever code review systems people might want to add. It also, on the job environment slide, it is intended for use with any sort of execution environment you might need. And we've got some drivers for the node management layer implemented already to allow you to use OpenStack, virtual machines, containers, bare metal systems, Amazon EC2 and EKS. Microsoft Azure driver is in progress. I just saw another update on it yesterday. There's one that's got changes up for review if people want to test it out. Supports Google Cloud, GCE and GKE, Kubernetes pods, where it will basically spin up a dedicated Kubernetes pod or multiple Kubernetes pods if you want for each build. And then you can interact with the API, and it's got some nice little hooks in there to expose the credentials and everything that the job then needs to do that easily. OpenShift, which had to have some slight differences, but is very similar to the Kubernetes driver. Also supports statically added, like separately managed servers if you need, or appliances. I know one organization that is using Zuul to test configuration on network switches, and you can't easily dynamically create a network switch. Some switch software virtualization solutions aside, generally a lot of things that you're trying to test on appliance type systems, you really need a lab with the hardware in it. So we've got people using it in that fashion just fine. And as previously mentioned, it's designed to do multi-node testing. It supports not only homogeneous node groups, but also heterogeneous. So, we've got some jobs that a team I'm on runs that does some stuff on an Ubuntu virtual machine, and some stuff on a CentOS virtual machine, and some stuff on a SUSE virtual machine, and some stuff on a Gentoo virtual machine, all within the context of a single build, to basically test certain actions across multiple platforms. So it can treat that as a single group of resources allocated to a particular build. On to the dependencies slide. A big part of what the sequencing functionality in Zuul allows is the ability to define arbitrary dependencies between changes. And we found that immensely useful over the years. Of course, there's the implicit ordering that happens in a dependent pipeline. If somebody is approving changes that are in related repositories and Zuul is sequencing those, then it basically considers them to be dependent on the changes that merged ahead of them from a contextual perspective when it's setting up the execution environments for the jobs. But you can also add your own explicit dependencies on other changes in commit message footers or in GitHub's case, because it tends to cluster commits into a single pull request. You can put it in the pull request description, and that will tell Zuul that it should fetch those other changes that you specified as dependencies and incorporate them into the build environment for the builds for your change. and also that it should not allow your change to merge unless the changes that you've declared as dependencies merge. So that's, and it can do that between different projects, but also across different source connections. So you can have a change in Garrett depending on a change in GitHub or whatever, and works out just fine. It, of course, it prepares the Git repositories themselves. So there's a standard role that will allow you to synchronize those to all of the job nodes as well. And basically the repository that's constructed has the dependent changes merged into the relevant branches of the repositories that are being requested by the job, so that you don't have to go try to have your job itself fetch all of those things. They're provided up front. And the last slide just has the URL to the Zool website, URL to the presentation source for the speaking notes that Fatih has been very generously streaming for you, and free license on the content there if anyone wants to reuse any of it. And that was 30 minutes. I am open to questions if there is time, and if Fatih does not need to move the meeting along.
I think we have time, about 10 minutes. Thanks, Jeremy.
You're welcome.
I have a question.
Sure.
Yeah. Now, yeah, I use Zool, and I'm kind of like, I know bits and pieces about Zool, but one thing that got my interest is like most of the focus is around the activities that happen near SCM systems like GitHub, Gerrit, and so on. What about the further, loops in CI flow or continuous delivery type of stuff? Like if you look at Jenkins, you can have like periodic jobs and so on. What about those things?
Yeah, but there's one of the non-source connector triggers that Zool implements is its timer trigger, which allows you to basically provide if anybody's familiar with how the time specs in a cron job are defined, you can basically provide a time spec like cron would use for your periodic pipeline. So it says, I want this job run at this frequency, at 6 a.m. every Monday, or at midnight the first day of each month, or however you want to schedule that every night at 2 a.m. And it runs all of those builds within the context of the repository canonical state at that time. Since there's no change context in that case, it's basically going to be running builds relative to the public state of your source code repositories. It fires an event for every branch. And so if you have jobs defined for some of those branches, then they will have builds run within that periodic pipeline. And you can define as many periodic pipelines with different timer triggers or multiple timer triggers as you like. And there's, I didn't mention it because this was more focused on the interoperability related features of the platform, but there is a central dashboard that records, if you enable the database reporting functionality and configure it to point to an SQL database, there is a dashboard component that will display your build history and allow you to look at those periodically run jobs as just the same as you could look at any of the CI event jobs driven from code review queues and inputs.
And you mentioned events now, like Gerrit has stream events, and that kind of like, if I remember correctly, like there was a driver for 0MQ or something like that. Because that's also, we had this captain presentation last week, previous meeting, and then IFO presentation during very first meeting. So what about those things, like event-based approach to?
I mean, there's really nothing that would prevent adding an arbitrary event stream driver in to function as a trigger. It probably would not. I mean, it really depends on what is being carried within the event payloads themselves. It may or may not be something that would be functional as a source connection as well, but could certainly be used to trigger builds. I know we've got somebody working on some features right now to allow arbitrary triggering through sort of a webhook implementation into the authenticated API. So, I mean, some of that stuff can also pretty easily be driven by external scripts if need be. But I mean, most of the power that you get out of Zool is going to come from the context surrounding the code review events. So it's really focused more on those workflows than on just being an arbitrary execution system. That's kind of more Jenkins realm, I think. And it's definitely not trying to be an alternative to Jenkins in general. It's mostly just focused on being a code review driven continuous integration project gating system. And people definitely do use Jenkins and Zool side by side for different things too. I know organizations that are doing that, so it's not an either or situation. There are some things that each one is better at, and I believe that people should use whatever the right tool is for the job.
I have a question with regards to dependency on Ansible itself. I understand you guys decided on the Ansible syntax for effectively a pipeline definition. I suppose, I mean, I'm familiar enough with Ansible. I mean, it does orchestration of things, obviously, but what is your actual dependency on Ansible runtime itself? Do you have one?
So yes, right now the way it's designed, it really can only call Ansible to perform actions. If that's what you're asking, there's no pluggable interface for swapping out an Ansible interpreter with something else.
So you really are relying on Ansible's underlying SSH connection, security, taking care of the keys and all of this. Okay.
Right. Well, not just SSH. I mean, it basically supports anything that Ansible can connect to. So I know BMW, for example, wrote an article about how they're using it to do integration tests on Windows using I forget the name of it, but the Ansible connection module that does Windows API, remote execution stuff. So I mean, it's really pretty much anything Ansible can connect to, Zool can run jobs on. But as a result, it is highly dependent on Ansible to be able to do those things. It does not natively implement its own remote execution functionality. That said, it doesn't rely strictly on Ansible's own security layers. It has its own key handling built in that basically attempts to sidestep a lot of the pitfalls where people will wind up just doing, no validation of remote host keys, those sorts of things. It also sandboxes the Ansible execution inside bubble wrap, which is basically like a very lightweight container implementation. So every time Ansible is called for a build, that Ansible process is isolated from all of the other Ansible processes on the central executor, which allows us to be a little bit more I guess, a little less worried about the possibility of crosstalk between Ansible processes, especially in situations like Zool was originally designed for, where you're testing proposed changes from untrusted sources. So we want to kind of guard against possible breakout or leveraging vulnerabilities in Ansible to influence the outcomes of other builds that might be handling sensitive information. And also it supports a range of Ansible versions, not just locked to one. You can actually have as many releases of Ansible as you want installed on the executor, and jobs can specify which Ansible version they want, especially if they're implementing specific functionality that only came about on a particular release of Ansible, and they want to make sure they're using that one, or they want to pin certain jobs to a specific Ansible release because they're worried that future changes in Ansible parser may break some less mainstream functionality they're relying on, that sort of thing. And it has its own Ansible management layer tooling. It's optional, but basically you can tell Zool, I want my executors to have this list of Ansible versions installed, and it creates separate Python virtual environments for each Ansible version that you've requested, and keeps them updated on all the executors, so they've got a consistent set.
Okay, that's, I figured there has to be something like that underneath for it to work like that. Much like in the way of how, Tecton is hook, line, and sinker connected to Kubernetes. That's what it requires. It sounds like Zool is the same thing. Ansible is the same thing to Zool. Okay, thanks very much for the presentation. A lot of parallels between this and Tecton, having been familiar with both Tecton and Ansible. We'll have to take a look if there's any concepts and things that can be brought across both systems, or even just borrow from concepts. It'd be really great.
Yep, and definitely the Zool IRC channel, mailing list, etc. There's folks happy to answer questions about how a lot of that works. Not just if you want to run Zool, but if you're really doing anything on related topics, we like talking about it. It's as we see it, free software is good regardless of whose project it is, and we're all in this together.
Excellent. Thank you very much for a presentation, Fatih. I do have to run. So
yeah, thanks a lot for joining. We are done already. The next meeting will be on April 2nd, and we'll have presentation from Jenkins X. So stay healthy, and talk to you in 2 weeks. Thank you, Jeremy, again for taking time to present Zool. Have a nice day.
You're welcome.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.